Thank you very much. When we look at the unity of the West facing global economic challenges, it's easy to be gloomy. Of all of the global economic challenges, probably the biggest one comes from Europe. The continued stagnation, and stagnation is a really optimistic way of looking at it, of the Eurozone is a huge problem, not just for Europe, not just for the United States, but for the whole world. So it's easy to be gloomy, and incidentally, for that I blame singularly the euro and the European Central Bank's policy. I think really it's our duty to repeat again and again and again that Greece's issues and the issues around the eurozone are really need to be laid at the foot of that failed project. But when we look at rates, which are growth rates, it's easy to forget that in terms of levels, Europe and the US are still remarkably leading the world. The European Union and the United States are by far the two largest economic blocs, and in terms of actual wealth and income, we're still miles ahead of any other potential rival, challenger. Probably isn't the best way to view kind of economic change, because China getting rich doesn't make us worse off. In fact, it makes us better off. So while emerging, or Frederick might prefer converging markets, might be growing rapidly, they're still a very, very long way off being anywhere near the size of the Western world, which means that when we take this kind of UKIP line that, oh, well, we need to choose between Europe and the world, it's a false choice, or at least it's not a choice that I would like us to make, because abandoning trade, at least with the European Union, would be abandoning trade with what may not be a very quickly growing bloc, but is certainly an extremely wealthy and extremely prosperous bloc in terms of the level of growth. And this tells us that there are significant welfare and economic gains that can come from economic liberalization and cooperation between the two largest economic blocs in the world. But these barriers, the barriers that TTIP is attempting to break down and other global trade agreements, are not tariff-based. And it's perhaps a sign of our success in making the argument for free trade, that free trade is no longer really about tariffs. Free trade is about regulations and regulatory barriers, things like safety standards, production restrictions, and so on. For me, this is the best argument in favor of the European Union, that it and other international agreements or other international organizations add a new dimension to domestic disputes and domestic political arrangements that lead to very, very bad regulations existing because of special interests. One such example of this is the Jones Act. As we approach the TTIP negotiations in the European Union, it's very easy to paint the United States as the Wild West. It is a free marketeer's paradise, and all the good social democrats in Europe need to worry about the race to the bottom that we're facing. But in fact, there are lots of bad regulations in the US that my hope is that, like Frederick, my hope is that negotiations like TTIP might add a new dimension to and allow the kind of reform of. So the Jones Act is a very interesting piece of legislation in the United States, which was passed in 1920, and I hope Elizabeth won't mind me focusing on this. I just find it a very interesting illustration of the kind of two-way street that it goes on in this negotiation. And essentially, the Jones Act requires that all goods transported by ship into the United States, if they wish to be transported to a second port after the first port's been visited, they have to be carried on a US flag-carrying ship that has been made in the United States, owned by US citizens, and crewed by US citizens and US permanent residents. So if you're bringing a ship of, let's say, French cheese over to the United States, you want to stop off in Boston or Maine, but your final destination is Florida. When you bring over this ship, you need to get everything off your European ship, or perhaps your Caribbean flagship, I don't know. You have to put it on to a US-owned, made, and crewed ship in order to go on. Now this actually, of course, it creates costs for European exporters and for international exporters. The biggest costs are borne by Americans because they pay much higher prices for transport. The maritime costs of transport are huge, particularly if you're somewhere like Alaska or Hawaii. These places cannot be used as stop-off points for trans-Pacific shipping, And anybody who wishes to kind of send something there or maybe send something to California, more or less has to go to Vancouver to refuel and then go back to Hawaii or back to Alaska. It's quite an amazing situation. John McCain tried to have this repealed in 2010 and failed. He, I believe, is trying again. And with the impetus that TPP and TTIP are bringing, seems to be having much more success. There is now a recognition, and this comes from possibly not Emma directly, but people like Emma on the European side and in the TPP side, who are arguing that this is a protectionist measure. It's a nakedly protectionist measure. There is no consumer-focused defense of this policy. And what TTIP has done, and I believe what TTIP may be doing, is adding this extra dimension that makes change and reform much, much more possible, because governments suddenly are no longer dealing with this domestic political arrangement, a kind of an equilibrium whereby very powerful unions, for example, can prevent reform. There's now this extra thing coming from outside, which, at least at the moment, seems to be pushing in direction of liberalization and reform in a positive way. I'm hoping that there are other moves in a similar fashion in the European Union. The regulatory fitness and performance program may be inspired, at least in part, by the need for more international cooperation on regulation. TTIP may allow us to drop quietly the very strict country origin rules that I think confuse consumers and can actually lead to consumers buying more expensive, less high quality products because they have basically a false idea of standards in other countries, and possibly a more sensible approach to things like pesticide rules and so on. If this is the case, then TTIP and agreements like it are very positive. And the unity of the West may not just be in breaking down barriers to trade between Europe and the US, but to trade within Europe and within the US, and cooperating with each other to scale back the very, very bad regulations that exist. In the future, I think that the low-hanging fruit to do with even regulatory reforms are probably mostly being picked. I think the next very significant area for reform that nobody has talked about yet is reforming migration. And I think that whatever your position is about migration from the Middle East, for example, or from developing countries, most of those arguments do not apply to migration from the United States or migration from Canada or from other kind of Commonwealth countries, large, rich, developed Commonwealth countries like that. And that is where there are huge economic gains to be made and huge gains in terms of personal freedom, both for European citizens and for the Western world. Thank you.